The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her radio pack and checked her weapon for the third time. The 24-member Marine Raider team moved through the rocky terrain like shadows, their boots finding purchase on stones worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Intelligence reports had indicated a high-value Taliban target was hiding in the remote canyon system ahead, and their mission was simple in concept but deadly in execution: capture or eliminate. Santos had earned her place among the elite raiders through years of proving herself in the most demanding environments the Corps could offer. Born in East LA to immigrant parents who worked 3 jobs between them, she understood struggle in ways that shaped her into the kind of leader who never left anyone behind. Her squad respected her not just for her tactical brilliance, but for the way she made decisions that kept everyone breathing. The canyon they approached was a geological marvel carved by ancient rivers into the mountainside. Towering walls of limestone and sandstone rose over 200 feet on either side, creating a natural corridor that stretched for nearly 2 miles before opening into a wider valley. Local villagers called it the throat of the mountain, and Santos was beginning to understand why. The entrance was narrow, forcing any approach into a funnel that made her tactical instincts scream warnings.
Lieutenant Colonel James Hawk Rodriguez, the team leader, had studied satellite imagery of the area for weeks.
A veteran of 4 combat deployments, he possessed the kind of battlefield intuition that came from surviving situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home or coming home in a box. The intel suggested their target, a bomb maker responsible for attacks that had killed dozens of coalition forces, was using caves deep in the canyon as a workshop and safe house. Rodriguez gathered his team leaders around a flat boulder that served as an impromptu briefing table. The plan was methodical. Alpha Team would advance through the canyon while Bravo Team took overwatch positions on the ridgeline above. Charlie Team would secure the entrance, preventing any escape back the way they came. It was textbook small unit tactics, the kind of operation these Marines had executed dozens of times in training and combat. What none of them knew was that their target had spent 3 years studying American tactics, learning from captured field manuals and debriefings with fighters who had survived encounters with Special Operations Forces. Khalil Ahmed was not just a bomb maker. He was a former Afghan army officer who had turned his military education against his former allies. He understood that Americans relied heavily on their technological advantages and standard operating procedures, and he had designed his trap accordingly. As Alpha Team began their advance into the canyon, Santos felt the weight of responsibility that came with leading Marines into harm's way. Each member of her team was someone's son or daughter, someone who had people waiting for them to come home. There was Corporal Jackson, a kid from rural Montana, who could hit a target at 800 meters in a crosswind. Sergeant Williams, a former gang member from Detroit who had found purpose and brotherhood in the Corps. Lance Corporal Chen, a cyber warfare specialist who could hack enemy communications while under fire. The canyon walls seemed to close in as they moved deeper into the geological formation. The path was clear, almost suspiciously so, but Santos pushed down her growing unease. Intel had been solid on previous operations, and the mission parameters were clear. Above them, Bravo Team reported negative contact as they moved along the ridgeline, their sniper teams finding good positions with clear fields of fire into the canyon below. What the Marines could not see were the carefully concealed positions that Ahmad had spent months preparing. Hidden behind false rock faces and camouflaged with natural materials, his fighters waited with the patience of hunters who understood that the most dangerous prey required the most careful preparation. They had studied the canyon's acoustics, learning how sound traveled and echoed off the walls. They knew which positions provided the best angles of fire, and which offered the quickest escape routes through passages too narrow for heavily equipped Western soldiers to follow. Ahmed had also studied the psychological aspects of ambush warfare. He understood that elite forces like the Marine Raiders were trained to fight their way out of conventional ambushes, but that their training assumed certain tactical principles would hold true. His plan was designed to turn those principles against them, to use their own doctrine and capabilities as weapons in his arsenal. As Alpha Team reached the halfway point of the canyon, Santos noticed something that made her pause. The rock formation ahead showed signs of recent disturbance, subtle changes in the way shadows fell and stones were arranged. Her years of experience had taught her to trust these small signals, the subconscious warnings that kept infantry soldiers alive in hostile territory. She was reaching for her radio to report the observation when the first explosion shattered the morning silence. The blast came not from ahead or behind, but from above. as charges hidden in the canyon walls brought down tons of rock at both ends of the geological corridor. The carefully placed explosives created perfect rock slides that sealed the Marines inside the canyon like insects in amber. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a rolling thunder that seemed to go on forever as stone crashed against stone. Dust and debris filled the air, turning daylight into a gray twilight that stung eyes and burned lungs. When the echoes finally faded, 24 of America's most elite warriors found themselves trapped in what had become a stone prison with walls that reached toward heaven. Santos immediately began assessing casualties and establishing a defensive perimeter, her training taking over even as her mind processed the tactical nightmare they now faced. The entrance and exit were completely blocked by rock slides that would take heavy equipment days to clear. Their radio communications with higher headquarters were blocked by the canyon walls, and their GPS signals were weak and intermittent in the narrow corridor. But Maria Santos had not survived 3 combat deployments by giving up when situations looked impossible.
As she looked at the faces of her Marines, she saw fear mixed with determination, the same expression she had seen in mirrors after firefights from Iraq to Afghanistan. These were warriors who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions the military had to offer, and they were not about to die quietly in a hole in the ground.
Ahmed's trap was perfect in its conception and execution, but he had made one critical error in his planning. He had studied American tactics and doctrine, but he had not studied Maria Santos. He did not understand that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the best plan or the most firepower, but the one who refuses to accept that defeat is possible. As the dust settled and the reality of their situation became clear, Santos began to see the canyon not as a prison, but as a potential weapon. The same geological features that trapped them could be turned against their enemies if she could find the right leverage points. The limestone walls that seemed so solid might have weaknesses that could be exploited. The narrow confines that limited their movement also limited their enemies' options for attack. She had always believed that every tactical problem had a solution if you looked at it from the right angle. Now, with the lives of 23 Marines depending on her ability to think beyond conventional warfare, Santos began to study the canyon with new eyes, looking for ways to transform their prison into their enemy's tomb. The first enemy probing attack came 3 hours after the rock slides sealed the canyon. Santos had used that time to organize her tracked Marines into fighting positions, distribute ammunition, and begin her detailed study of their stone prison. The attack was brief but telling: sniper fire from concealed positions high on the canyon walls, followed by the distinctive whistle of rocket-propelled grenades that exploded against the limestone with bone-jarring concussions. What made the attack truly dangerous was not its intensity, but its precision. The enemy knew exactly where the Marines had taken cover, could predict their movements, and seemed to understand their tactical responses before they made them. It became clear that Ahmad had not just trapped them, he had turned the canyon into a carefully designed killing field where every angle of fire favored the attackers. Santos crouched behind a boulder that provided minimal cover from the plunging fire coming from above. Around her, Marines returned fire when they could identify targets, but their enemies remained largely invisible, hidden behind prepared positions that had been months in the making. The enemy fighters would appear just long enough to take a few shots, then vanish back into concealment before the Marines could bring effective fire to bear. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez crawled over to Santos's position during a lull in the firing. His face was grim as he assessed their tactical situation. They had food and water for perhaps 2 days if they were careful. Ammunition was plentiful for now, but would not last long if the enemy kept up sustained pressure. Most critically, their radio communications remained blocked, meaning no one knew they were trapped or where to send reinforcement. "Ideas, Santos?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the weight of command responsibility. He had led Marines through some of the worst fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, but this situation was beyond anything in the tactical manuals. They were cut off, outnumbered, and fighting from the bottom of a hole against enemies who held every advantage terrain could provide. Santos had been studying the canyon walls with the intensity of an archaeologist examining ancient ruins. The limestone showed clear stratification, layers of sedimentary rock laid down over millions of years. Some layers appeared harder than others, and she had noticed hairline cracks running through certain sections. More importantly, she had observed something the enemy probably did not realize. The acoustics of the canyon were so precise that sound could be used to locate hidden positions with remarkable accuracy. "Sir, I think they made a mistake when they triggered the rock slides," she said, pointing to the blocked canyon entrance. "Look at the way the rocks fell. They used too much explosive force, and it created instabilities in the wall structure. See those stress fractures running up from the blast point? The whole face is compromised. Rodriguez followed her gaze and began to see what she was seeing. The explosion that had trapped them had also weakened the canyon walls in ways that might be exploitable. But even if they could bring down sections of the wall, how would that help them escape what was essentially a stone box? Santos had been thinking about that problem since the first enemy shots rang out. Sir, what if escape isn't the objective? What if we make this canyon so dangerous for them that they have to come down here to finish us, and we turn their advantage into ours? The concept was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of trying to break out of their prison, they would turn it into a trap for their enemies. The same geological features that confined the Marines could be used to create a controlled collapse that would eliminate enemy fighting positions and force any survivors into close-quarters combat where Marine training and equipment would provide decisive advantages. But executing such a plan would require intimate knowledge of the rock formations, precise timing of explosive charges, and the kind of calculated risk-taking that could either save all their lives or kill them all in a cascade of falling stone. Santos knew she was proposing to bet everything on her ability to read stone and geology like a tactical map. The next enemy attack came as the afternoon sun created deep shadows in the canyon. This time, Ahmed's fighters tried a different approach, rappelling down the canyon walls to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. It was a bold move that showed they were growing confident in their ability to eliminate the trapped Marines through conventional tactics. Santos watched the attack develop with professional interest, noting how the enemy moved, where they placed their ropes, and which sections of the wall they seemed to trust with their weight. Every detail provided information about the geological structure and the enemy's understanding of it. She noticed that they avoided certain areas entirely, sections where the rock face appeared solid but which they apparently knew to be unstable. The firefight was intense but brief. Marine marksmanship and superior equipment won the day, with 3 enemy fighters killed and the others forced to retreat back up their ropes.
But Santos knew this was just a probing attack, a way for Ahmad to test their defenses and casualties rates.
The real assault would come later, probably at night when darkness would provide additional concealment for attackers moving down the walls. As the Marines tended their wounded and redistributed ammunition, Santos began moving through their positions with a seemingly random pattern. To a casual observer, she appeared to be checking on her Marines and coordinating defensive preparations. In reality, she was conducting a detailed acoustic survey of the canyon, using the echoes of voice and movement to map the hidden structures around them. She discovered that the canyon was even more complex than it appeared from ground level. The walls contained numerous caves and passages, some natural and others clearly excavated by human hands.
That was the first time somebody came to the news.
The enemy had turned the entire geological formation into a 3-dimensional fighting position, with firing ports, supply caches, and escape routes that were invisible from below. But Santos also discovered something that Ahmad had probably not considered. The canyon's acoustic properties meant that sound traveled through the rock itself, creating resonance patterns that could be amplified and focused. If she could place explosive charges at precisely the right points, she could create harmonic vibrations that would shatter specific rock faces while leaving others intact. The plan that began forming in her mind was unprecedented in its scope and ambition. She would use the Marines' remaining explosive ordnance to create a series of controlled collapses that would seal enemy positions, eliminate their height advantage, and force them into a ground-level fight where Marine close-quarters combat training would prove decisive. Sergeant Williams, the former gang member from Detroit, crawled over to Santos's position as she was sketching diagrams in the dirt with a piece of broken stone. Williams had grown up in neighborhoods where survival meant understanding the architecture of violence, and he recognized the look of someone planning something dangerous and necessary.
Staff Sergeant, you got that look again?
Williams said quietly. Same look you had before you walked into that house in Fallujah where we knew there were 6 insurgents waiting to kill whoever came through the door. Santos looked up from her sketches. Williams was right. She was planning something that would require Marines to walk into almost certain death in order to create the possibility of life for everyone else. The charges would have to be placed by hand, which meant someone would have to climb the canyon walls under enemy fire and plant explosives in positions that might collapse while they were still on the rock face. Williams, I need volunteers for a climbing mission, she said. It's gonna be dangerous, and I can't guarantee anyone who goes up those walls is coming back down alive. Williams grinned, the same expression he had worn in a dozen firefights where the odds were terrible but the mission was necessary.
Staff Sergeant, you saved my life in 3 different countries.
If you need someone to climb rocks and blow stuff up, I'm your man. By evening, Santos had identified 12 Marines with climbing experience and the technical skills needed to place charges with precision. The plan required them to ascend the canyon walls at multiple points simultaneously, plant explosives at carefully calculated positions, and then rappel back down before the controlled detonations could catch them on the rock face. The greatest risk was that Ahmed's fighters would detect the climbing teams before they could complete their mission. But Santos had studied the enemy's patterns and believed she understood their weaknesses. They had grown overconfident in their impregnable position and were not expecting the trapped Marines to take offensive action. As darkness fell over the canyon, Santos gathered her volunteers around the boulder that had become their command post. Each Marine understood that they were about to attempt something that had never been tried before, turning a geological formation into a weapon of war through controlled demolition and tactical audacity. "We chose to spend our past entire lives." Remember, Santos told them as they checked their climbing gear and explosive charges, "We're not trying to bring down the whole canyon. We're performing surgery with high explosives, and precision is everything." Miss your mark by 6 inches, and we all die under 1,000 tons of rock. The enemy had studied American tactics, but they had never encountered anything like what Maria Santos was planning. In a few hours, Ahmad would learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is not the one with the best position or the most firepower, but the one who can see possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare. The ascent began at 020 hours, when the new moon provided maximum darkness, and the enemy sentries would be fighting their natural circadian rhythms. Santos had divided her climbing teams into 4 groups, each targeting specific sections of the canyon walls where her acoustic analysis suggested the rock formations would amplify explosive effects most efficiently. Sergeant Williams led the first team up the north wall, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to climb not in military schools but on the fire escapes and abandoned buildings of urban Detroit. His hands found holds in the limestone that seemed invisible to others, and he moved upward with the confidence of a man who had decided that falling was simply not an option. Corporal Jackson, the Montana sharpshooter, led the second team up a route that would bring them directly above the largest concentration of enemy firing positions. His rural background had taught him to read terrain like a book, to understand how weather and geology shaped the landscape in ways that could be exploited by those who paid attention. Santos herself took the most dangerous route, a nearly vertical section of the west wall where stress fractures from the original rock slide had created a network of potential failure points. If her theory about harmonic resonance was correct, properly placed charges here could trigger a cascade effect that would neutralize multiple enemy positions simultaneously. The climb was terrifying in its intimacy with death. Every handhold could be the one that gave way. Every footstep could dislodge stones that would alert enemy sentries to their presence. The Marines climbed in near complete silence, communicating through hand signals and a kind of wordless coordination that came from years of training together.
Halfway up the west wall, Santos discovered something that made her blood run cold.
The rock face was not as solid as it appeared from below. Entire sections were held in place by nothing more than friction and the distribution of weight. Ahmed had not just weakened the canyon walls with his explosives. He had created a geological house of cards that could collapse at any moment with catastrophic results. But this discovery also revealed the true genius of Ahmad's trap. He had not just sealed the Marines in the canyon. He had created a situation where any attempt to use explosives against the walls could bring down the entire formation, killing everyone in the enclosed space. It was a masterstroke of tactical psychology, designed to paralyze enemy decision-making by making every aggressive action potentially suicidal. Santos hung from her climbing rope 150 feet above the canyon floor, studying the stress patterns in the rock with new understanding. Ahmed had anticipated that trapped American forces would attempt to blast their way out, and he had prepared the canyon walls to collapse catastrophically if they tried. What he had not anticipated was someone who would try to use that instability as a weapon rather than fight against it. The key was precision. Instead of trying to prevent the collapse, Santos would trigger it in a controlled sequence that eliminated enemy positions while creating protective overhangs for the Marines below. It would require split-second timing and the kind of mathematical precision usually reserved for demolitions engineers working under laboratory conditions. Williams reached his target position first, a natural ledge that provided access to what appeared to be a major enemy supply cache. The cave entrance was concealed behind a facade of natural rock, but the acoustic signatures Santos had detected suggested it extended deep into the canyon wall. Eliminating this position would cut enemy supply lines and force them to rely on whatever ammunition and explosives they already had in forward positions. The placement of charges required delicate work with fingers that were cramping from the cold mountain air and the strain of extended climbing. Each explosive device had to be positioned at precise angles calculated to direct the blast energy into specific stress points in the rock formation. Too much explosive force would trigger an uncontrolled collapse. Too little would have no effect at all. Jackson's team had discovered something unexpected. The enemy positions were connected by a series of tunnels that turned the entire canyon wall into a honeycomb of fighting positions and supply routes. Ahmad had not just prepared firing positions, he had created an underground fortress that could support a prolonged siege against forces trapped in the canyon below. This discovery changed everything about Santos's plan. Instead of targeting individual positions, she now understood that they needed to collapse entire sections of the tunnel network to eliminate the enemy's tactical advantage. But doing so would require far more explosive force than they had available, unless she could find a way to amplify the effects through geological leverage. The solution came to her as she studied the limestone formations in the dim light of her red lens flashlight. The canyon walls showed clear evidence of ancient water damage, underground rivers that had carved extensive cave systems throughout the rock formation. Many of these caves were filled with loose sediment and debris, creating natural tamped charges that could be triggered by relatively small explosions. Santos began to see the canyon as a vast musical instrument, with each cave and tunnel representing a different note that could be played through carefully orchestrated demolition. By triggering collapses in the right sequence, she could create a harmonic resonance effect that would bring down the entire enemy fortress while leaving escape routes open for the Marines below.
The technical challenge was staggering.
She was essentially trying to conduct a symphony orchestra using high explosives as instruments, with the lives of 24 Marines depending on her ability to read geological formations like sheet music. One miscalculation, one charge placed 6 inches off target, and everyone in the canyon would be buried under thousands of tons of rock. At 0330 hours, all climbing teams reported they were in position and ready for synchronized detonation. Santos looked down at her Marines spread across the canyon floor, each one trusting that her plan would work because she had never led them into a situation they could not fight their way out of. The weight of that trust was almost unbearable. Ahmad's fighters had detected unusual activity during the night, but had not identified the specific threat. They knew the Marines were planning something, but their overconfidence in their impregnable position had made them complacent about the possibility of vertical assault. Their sentries watched the canyon floor but paid little attention to the walls above their heads. The first charges detonated at exactly 0400 hours, timed to coincide with the moment when human alertness was naturally at its lowest point. The explosions were not particularly loud by battlefield standards, but their effects were amplified by the canyon's acoustic properties into a rolling thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. Santos felt the vibrations travel through the rock face beneath her hands, following the stress patterns she had mapped during her acoustic survey. The limestone began to sing, a deep harmonic tone that built in intensity as each successive charge added its voice to the geological chorus. Cave systems that had been stable for centuries began to collapse in sequence, each failure triggering the next in a precisely orchestrated cascade of destruction. The enemy fortress that Ahmad had spent years constructing began to come apart like a house of cards in an earthquake. Firing positions that had seemed impregnable were suddenly filled with rubble and dust. Supply routes that connected different sections of the defensive network were severed by rockfalls that sealed tunnels behind tons of broken stone. But Santos's plan was only half complete. The controlled collapses had eliminated the enemy's height advantage and cut their supply lines, but Ahmad and his remaining fighters were still alive and now desperately dangerous. They would be forced to abandon their prepared positions and fight at ground level, where Marine training and equipment would provide decisive advantages. If the Marines could survive the transition from defensive to offensive operations, as the dust began to settle and the echoes of falling rock faded to silence, Santos rappelled back down to the canyon floor to find her Marines already moving to exploit the tactical opportunities she had created. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but the final phase of the battle was just beginning. Ahmed had studied American tactics for years, but he had never encountered anything like Maria Santos. Now he would learn that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the best prepared positions or the most careful planning, but the one who can transform the battlefield itself into a weapon of war. The silence after the controlled collapses was more terrifying than the explosions themselves. Santos crouched in the dust-filled canyon, straining to hear any sounds that would indicate enemy survivors or secondary collapses that could still kill her Marines. The air was thick with limestone powder that turned breathing into a struggle and made visibility nearly zero.
Through the settling dust, she could see that her plan had worked better than she had dared hope.
Entire sections of the canyon walls had collapsed in precisely the sequence she had calculated. sealing enemy positions while creating protective overhangs for her Marines below. But more importantly, the collapses had opened new passages through the rockfall at both ends of the canyon, creating potential escape routes that had not existed an hour earlier. Ahmad was still alive, but his carefully prepared fortress had been turned into a death trap for his own fighters.
Santos could hear shouting in Pashto from somewhere in the rubble-filled caves above, the voices of men who suddenly found themselves trapped in collapsing tunnels with no way to reach their ammunition supplies or coordinate their defensive efforts. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez moved through the swirling dust to reach Santos's position.
His face was grim with the realization that their situation, while dramatically improved, was still far from resolved. The enemy might be disorganized and cut off from their prepared positions, but they were desperate now, and desperate enemies were often the most dangerous.
Status report, Santos, Rodriguez ordered, his voice barely audible over the continuing sounds of settling rock and distant shouts from trapped enemy fighters. Sir, we've eliminated their height advantage and cut their main supply routes, Santos replied, checking her weapon and ammunition while keeping one eye on the newly created passages through the rockfall.
But we've probably got survivors who are going to try to fight their way out through the same routes we need to use for our own escape. The tactical situation had been completely reversed in the space of an hour. Instead of Marines trapped in a killing field, they now had enemy fighters trapped in collapsed positions with limited ammunition and no command coordination.
But the physical escape routes were still contested terrain, and getting 24 Marines through narrow passages while under fire would require the same kind of precise planning that had brought down the canyon walls. Santos had studied the rockfall patterns created by her controlled demolitions, and she believed she understood which passages offered the best opportunities for movement. The key was speed and coordination. They needed to move fast enough to prevent the enemy from regrouping while maintaining the unit cohesion necessary for effective fire and movement through constricted terrain. The first enemy fighter appeared at the mouth of one of the newly opened passages just as Santos was explaining her movement plan to the squad leaders. He was covered in dust and clearly disoriented, firing wildly in the general direction of the Marines without proper target acquisition. Corporal Jackson ended the threat with a single, precisely placed shot that demonstrated why he had been selected for sniper training. But that single fighter told Santos everything she needed to know about enemy capabilities and intentions. They were trying to escape through the same passages the Marines needed to use, and they were willing to fight their way out even without coordination or adequate ammunition. The next few hours would be a race to see who could control the choke points that led out of what had become a shared prison. Ahmed himself appeared at the top of a rubble pile that had once been a concealed fighting position. Even at a distance, Santos could see that he was wounded, but still functional. Still trying to coordinate his surviving fighters through hand signals and shouted commands. He was looking directly at her, and she realized that he understood exactly what she had done to his carefully prepared fortress. The look that passed between them was one of professional recognition.
Ahad had spent years studying American tactical doctrine, and he knew that what Santos had accomplished was far beyond anything taught in military schools or covered in field manuals.
She had improvised a form of warfare that turned geology itself into a weapon system, and he was studying her methods even as he prepared to kill her. Santos felt a strange moment of respect for an enemy who could appreciate tactical innovation even while planning her destruction. Ahmed was clearly a professional soldier who understood that war was ultimately about problem-solving under extreme pressure, and he was adapting to the new tactical reality she had created, with the same flexibility that had made him dangerous in the first place.
The firefight that erupted across the debris-filled canyon was unlike anything Santos had experienced in 3 combat deployments.
Instead of fighting for control of terrain features, they were fighting for control of passages through collapsed rock, narrow spaces where individual marksmanship and close-quarters combat training mattered more than unit tactics or supporting arms. Williams led the first movement through a passage that Santos had identified as offering the best combination of cover and fields of fire. The former gang member moved through the rubble-choked space with the fluid confidence of someone who had learned urban warfare in neighborhoods where survival depended on understanding how violence moved through confined spaces. The passage was barely wide enough for a Marine in full combat gear, forcing them to move in single file through a space that could become a fatal funnel if enemy fighters managed to establish firing positions at either end. But Santos had calculated the angles carefully, and the protective overhangs created by her controlled collapses provided cover from plunging fire that would have made movement impossible in the original canyon configuration. Jackson and his sniper team had found positions among the fallen rocks that provided overlapping fields of fire covering the Marine movement routes. Their precision shooting was what made the difference, eliminating enemy fighters who tried to establish positions that could interdict the Marine escape routes. Each shot was carefully placed to avoid ricochets in the confined space that could endanger friendly forces. Ahad was proving to be as dangerous in defeat as he had been in his prepared positions. Even wounded and cut off from most of his fighters, he was using the terrain with the skill of someone who understood that individual initiative could still influence the outcome of small unit actions. He appeared and disappeared among the rocks like a ghost, always seeming to know exactly where the Marines would move next. Santos found herself in a deadly game of tactical chess played out among the rubble of collapsed limestone. Each move had to be calculated not just for its immediate tactical value, but for how it would influence the next sequence of moves by an enemy who was proving to be as innovative as she was. The margin for error was measured in inches and seconds. The breakthrough came when Sergeant Williams discovered that one of the collapsed tunnel systems had created an unexpected opportunity. The rockfall had punched through into a natural cave system that connected to the valley beyond the canyon, providing a covered route that bypassed the contested passages entirely. But using this route would require leaving wounded Marines behind, at least temporarily, and Santos had never abandoned anyone in 3 deployments. The decision that faced her was the kind that defined military careers and haunted officers for the rest of their lives. Save the unit by sacrificing individuals, or risk everyone in an attempt to bring out every Marine alive. Rodriguez understood the tactical mathematics as clearly as Santos did. In his 4 combat deployments, he had made similar decisions that balanced unit survival against individual lives, and he knew that command authority meant accepting responsibility for choices that had no perfect answers. "Santos," he said quietly, "you've gotten us this far by thinking beyond the manual. What does your gut tell you about getting everyone out?" Santos looked at the faces of her Marines, men and women who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions because they believed in each other and in leaders who would never leave them behind. She thought about the families waiting at home, the parents who had raised these young Americans to be warriors who served something larger than themselves. The solution came to her as she studied the pattern of rockfalls and natural passages that her demolitions had revealed. The cave system that Williams had discovered was just one part of a larger network that could be used to evacuate the wounded, while the remaining Marines fought a delaying action through the original passages. It would require splitting her force and conducting simultaneous operations through multiple routes, the kind of complex maneuver that was typically attempted only by units with extensive rehearsal time and detailed intelligence. But Santos had learned that desperate situations sometimes required solutions that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional military wisdom. As the sun began to rise over the canyon that had been transformed from a trap into a battlefield, Maria Santos prepared to lead her Marines through one final tactical problem. Ahmad was still alive somewhere in the rubble, still dangerous, still capable of influencing the outcome through individual action and tactical innovation. But Santos had discovered something about herself during the long night of controlled demolitions and close-quarters combat. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon was not firepower or technology, but the willingness to see possibilities that existed beyond what anyone had attempted before. The canyon had spoken, and she had learned its language.